So somewhere along the line on your private practice journey, there's going to come a time when you're going to have to take off those many hats that you are wearing and pass them on to someone else, whether that means outsourcing to someone externally or employing somebody into your practice. When the time comes that you do need to employ somebody in your practice, you want to make sure that you are abiding by the country's basic conditions of employment acts, as well as the ethical guidelines of the Health Professions Council. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about in today's video. If you're new here, I'm Tasneem Abrahams. I'm the founder of the Private Practice Growth Club, and I share tips, tools and tutorials for health professionals who want to start and grow private practices in South Africa. If this is your jam, then don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the bell for notifications for when new videos are released. So I'm going to introduce our guest today, who I'm really excited and happy that she was willing to avail herself at night. And it's all difficult for a lot of us with young kids and having to juggle so many things during the daytime as well. So I'm very grateful for her for making the time to do this for us. And like I mentioned as well in the description of this masterclass, I myself did the CPD course on Calabash by Annelie, and it was so interesting, very well presented. She's extremely knowledgeable about this topic, so I think that you are in for quite a treat. So who is our special guest today? So our special guest, Annelie van der Westhuyzen, is a speech therapist with a master's degree in bioethics and health law. So again, I'm not only having OTs as guests, I'm very happy when there are other professions who are willing to share their knowledge and expertise. So if you have something you would like to share with our little community here, please do reach out to me and I would be so happy to have you as a guest. So she is a part-time lecturer and clinical educator in the speech, language and hearing therapy division at Stellenbosch University. In 2011, she established Ethics Simplified, which is an ethics and health law consultancy company providing guidance to healthcare professionals across the country. She presents workshops on various aspects of bioethics and health law, and recently also started producing material for online viewing. And this is, like I mentioned, with Calabash, which I've done some of her courses. She also works closely with Little Steps, providing support and training on the neurodevelopmental supportive care of the preterm infant, her other area of interest. Annelie lives in Cape Town with her husband and 2 boys. So definitely qualified to be doing this talk. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to bring her up onto the screen right now. And welcome, Annelie.
Thank you, Tasneem. It's lovely to join you from a very cold Cape Town at the moment.
I believe so, yes. I believe it's cold. And we're also expecting a cold front to come over tomorrow and over to the weekend as well in Johannesburg.
Yeah. So I think the rain it started today and it's probably going to last until Tuesday, so which is lovely for us. But it is quite chilly outside. So thank you for having me. I'm excited for doing this talk with you.
So to give some background and context to how this came about, obviously a lot of us belong to like the allied therapy Facebook groups, and there's a lot of questions that come up very commonly around locums and employment, and in particular over recent times there was one particular post that caused quite a lot of engagement and discussion around the issue of employment, and in particular with younger, less experienced therapists. And I think I know from as an older therapist, the younger therapists now are struggling with finding work. It wasn't as bad when we first graduated, especially now that you go into community service, and then after that it's like you kind of almost pigeonholed into a particular area of interest, because wherever you were placed. And I think with the high rate of unemployment, people are struggling, and so they kind of are turning to the private sector. And so I think it's a problem. The issue of employment ethics has been a problem for a long time. It's just a lot more prevalent now because there are a lot more younger therapists who are actually going that route. So that was the context of why this topic came about, because you had commented on there, and that's how I discovered who you were. I had already known about Ethics Simplified for a while, but I didn't know it was you until you commented. And that's why I approached you, because I think that it's a very important topic to be discussed for private practice owners. And this is something I've spoken a lot about in the group and interacting with therapists, is that as health professionals, if you are in private practice, you must remember you are running a business. And as a business owner, you need to think of all the legal aspects. You can't just be doing your clinical things and then thinking, okay, that's going to be good enough. There are so many things you need to consider as a business owner in general. And now on top of that, we have these Health Professions Council rules to protect ourselves and our patients. So, so let's get straight into that. Where do you want to start off the discussion?
I think what you've touched on just now is so relevant, is that, yes, we are healthcare professionals that are guided by the HPCSA. So their mandate mainly is to protect and serve the public and guide the healthcare professional. So what they want from us is whatever we do, whether we're doing clinical work, whether we employ people, whether we run a business, that needs to be structured in order to act in the best interest of our clients. So I think we have a general idea what that means, but now when you bring in relevant health law or any other law in South Africa, you have to also consider that, because you still are either a business owner or a citizen in South Africa that needs to comply to the rules. And I think the most recent legislation, the POPI Act, that has been promulgated now from the 1st of July is a very good example where we as healthcare professionals have to comply to a specific legislation as well as adhere to the HPCSA regulations, and almost finding a way to marry those two and still be ethical and still be legal in our practices. And definitely with employment ethics, that's probably the one area where we see a lot of things going on which is not legal and definitely not ethical.
And I think the important thing to remember is that it's in fact, a lot of the unethical employment behaviors are not actually even things that are unique to the health professions. Health professions. There's a lot of things that people are doing that for all business owners it's applicable for all business owners, because a lot of the complaints are around, but how are we supposed to run a successful practice if we are so so restricted by the council, when it's not in fact the council, it's the actual labor law of the country. So maybe you can comment on what are some of the key labor laws that people need to be more cognizant of when they are deciding to go into private practice.
I think when I started developing this specific workshop on employment ethics, my goal was to unpack the different legal aspects of employment. I mean, I've heard and I've seen so many young therapists entering into a private practice role as, I mean, they call themselves locums, but even the term locum, the way we understand it, is not the way it's written into legislation and written according to the HPCSA. So there's a lot of exploitation that takes place of younger therapists by established practices, not always out of intent, a lot of times due to lack of knowledge. So the two main legislations that addresses employment is the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, as well as the Labor Relations Act. So those are the two main things that does address employment ethics. So the Basic Conditions of Employment Act that deals with what are the benefits. If somebody is an employee, what benefits can they expect to receive from the employer? And the Labor Relations Act deals more with sort of your structuring as a employer, whether you're an independent contractor, the length of a contract, and those type of things.
Yeah, so I think also, and when we're talking about this as private practice owners, it's important also to remember it's not in isolation to other therapists that you might have in your employ. I think people also tend to forget that even if you have somebody come and clean your therapy office, that person also is an employee. So a lot of therapists I see are thinking only of the reception staff or the therapists as people that they are employing, but anybody that you are outsourcing work to, unless, like you say, they are independent contractors, they are in your employ. So maybe we can touch on that a bit. What would be the difference between somebody who is an outsourced service versus somebody who you actually now need to adhere to the labor laws of the country?
So basically, what is the difference then between a locum and an independent contractor and a true employer? All right. So if we think of the term locum, the way I think the way healthcare professionals generally use the term is they use the term for somebody that works at my practice, but I don't employ them. I don't pay them paid leave. They might work for me full time, or they might work for me certain days of the week or a number of hours per day. So that's what we use the term locum as. So I will say, no, I locum at that specific practice, or I locum on weekends at that specific practice. And that's not really the true definition of the word locum. And so if we look at the fundamentals of the word locum, it means somebody holding the place of. So if I go on maternity leave, I get a locum to come work in my spot. So it's not two therapists working at the same time. It's one therapist working in the place of another therapist. So somebody taking over your role for a number of months, days, hours, depending on how you want to go about it. So that is the term locum. And what the HPCSA says is that you may only employ a locum for 6 months. You may not employ a locum for more than 6 months. And a locum is very often a contractual post that you offer somebody. And when we look at the Labor Relations Act, what they say is that you may only, as they sort of make, or I think the term locum becomes a sort of an exception because it's a very specific time period that you do use a locum for. What the Labor Relations Act says is that you may only employ somebody on a contractual basis for 3 months. Unless, like for instance, ComServe, it's a very specific 12-month contract, and thereafter that person is not entitled to any benefits after the 12-month period. Whereas traditionally what we see in healthcare, especially amongst the allied healthcare professionals, is that they employ somebody for years on end in this type of contractual position where they don't get any benefits. So that is basically the term locum. Then the big difference comes in between an independent contractor and an employee at your practice. An independent contractor is somebody that comes and offers a service at your practice. So if I want to build at my house, I would get a contractor to come and build at my house. I'm not employing them. It's a contractor that comes and builds. It's their own business that they are providing services to me. And the Labor Relations Act in section 300 or 200A very specifically gives us guidance in terms of how to distinguish between an employee and an independent contractor. And I think let's go to that specific slide. So if you can just quickly share the slideshow, and I will just go to that specific slide that All right, so it's called the 7 conditions. And is that the slide that you are seeing there in front of you as well? Yes. So it's the 7 conditions. It says that if you want to distinguish whether somebody is an employee or independent contractor, if any one of these 7 conditions are at play, that person is not considered an independent contractor. That person is considered an employee, and they should receive the full benefits of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, which we will speak about a bit later. So number 1, the first condition is if the manner in which that person works is subject to the control or the direction of the person to whom the services are rendered. So we very often see contracts that are stipulated or drawn up in such a way to say, you are an independent contractor, you rent space in my practice, but you have to do the following, or you have to see so many clients a day, or you have to be in the office between 8 and 4 in the afternoon. So already that type of clause in your contract throws that contract out as an independent contractor contract, and that person is considered an employee. The second condition, if the person's hours of work are subject to the control or the direction of the person to whom the services are rendered, like I just spoke about. Number 3, in the case of a person who renders services to an organization or forms part of that organization. So that is it's not necessarily very relevant to healthcare professionals, but if you work at Mediclinic, for instance, and you only work at Mediclinic, and Mediclinic sort of dictates a lot of things on how you do, you could be considered as an employee of Mediclinic, for instance. The fourth condition, if the person has worked for the person to whom services are rendered for an average of at least 40 hours per month over the last 3 months. So if you work at least 40 hours per month over the last 3 months for that specific practice, if you are economically dependent on that specific person to whom the services are rendered, if the person is provided with tools of the trade, so equipment or tests, a battery of tests or practice therapy equipment is provided for you by this person, and if you only work for or render services to that one specific person. Now, what the Labor Relations Act says is even if and we can stop sharing that screen, even if your practice, even if your contract is drawn up in such a manner that it clearly stipulates you're an independent contractor, but if they look at those 7 conditions, the way you operate in that specific practice, if any one of those conditions are true, if there's any dispute in terms of that contract, they will scrutinize that contract as if it was a contract with an employee. So if the supposed independent contractor challenges the practice owner, the courts will look at how it was operated, how the relationship, they will look at the relationship of the work, and they will then interpret that as an employee and not necessarily as an independent contractor.
Okay, so I think if we look at it then from the flip side, from the perspective of the person who's looking for work. So a lot of health professionals, when they are exploring going into private practice, one of the ways that they often do that is through first locuming, so that they can get a feel for what private practice actually, how it works, and sort of get a feel for working in a practice. So what would you say as advice for young therapists who are now going into the private practice space? Should they be aware of and make sure to protect themselves? And also how, I think a lot of the problem is because, you're desperate for the job. So, you don't really have that bargaining power because now this person can just say no, but they'll just hire the next person. So what would your advice be for the younger therapists wanting to break into the private practice space?
And I do understand why somebody wants to go locum somewhere before they enter into a permanent contract. But instead of calling yourself a locum, then why not call yourself a part-time employee or a temporary employee? And you are allowed to enter into a contractual for, say, I want to work for or at this practice on a contract basis for 3 months before we make a decision whether we want to go over to full employment. So my suggestion merely is to, I think, if you are not clued up, have somebody who is clued up look through that contract and see whether your rights are protected in that contract. Very often it is the employee's rights that aren't protected in those specific contracts. So look at the working hours. How are they paying you? Are they giving you leave? Are they giving you the basic benefits that you are entitled to? And have a look at that. I mean, I think my reasoning, like I said earlier, for developing these workshops was due to the amount of exploitation that's taking place out there, where therapists work years without paid annual leave at the same practice, or they work years without, if they're sick, they don't get paid, so it's also to do with the structuring of the payment of that specific contract. So there's so many areas where they could be exploited that we have to, and my suggestion is let somebody look through that contract with you to see whether your rights are protected. We've just recently worked with a specific contract where a therapist or the practice owner is trying to protect the schools that she's got access to. And she tries to claim ownership of a specific school and not allow anybody else into that school. And that's nonsense. I mean, you, the practice owner, cannot claim ownership of a specific school. It's the principal that says, yes, you can work here, but you can also allow somebody else to work there if it's what they want. So it's not you that dictates where your practice is situated. It's the principal ultimately, or the superintendent of the hospital may decide who's got access to the school or the specific hospital.
I'm glad you bring that up, because that is another thing that has come up in the groups a lot, where people have maybe experienced this and then they ask opinion, where they ask so what would happen is they either locuming for a practice or they are employed in a practice, and then in their contract there is a non-compete clause. So where they are told that within a certain period of time they are not allowed to. So there's two, and the one that I've heard of, which I found was absurd, was where the person was even told not even that they can't open their own practice, but they can't also go and work for another private practice in the same niche, sort of in a certain radius within a certain period of time. So what is your comments on that? Like, what is how ethical is that?
So it's called a restraint of trade, which is a legal thing. You may have a restraint of trade clause in your contract. However, you may never withhold somebody from earning an income. So I think the problem comes in when you work in a big city. If you have a restraint of trade clause, it is easily enforceable. But if you limit it to a specific niche area, it's easily enforceable. But if it's a very general, very broad restraint of trade contract, and you live in a smaller, a suburb or a small town, if your restraint of trade says you're not allowed to open your own practice within a 15-kilometer radius, I mean, that will prevent that person from earning an income because of that specific restraint of trade. So a restraint of trade, it is legal, but enforcing it very often is costly. It takes a lot of legal resources, and very often the people don't have the money to fight that or don't have the money to oppose that, and then they would just let it go. The other thing regarding a restraint of trade, which the HPCSA says, is that the client has the right to choose where they want to go to. So no practice may claim ownership of a client. that client has the free will to go and request services from somebody else if that somebody else does have their own private practice. So we see this very often where therapists will say, but you stole my client, or you're not allowed to contact the client, or you're not allowed to contact anybody at the school. And it's not about them contacting them. It's about the clients reaching out and say, but I have a therapeutic relationship with you, which I want to continue. So I will go with you to wherever you go to. And no practice owner may prevent that client from doing that, because we cannot take ownership of a client. And we very often find this, and this is not really about employment ethics, but where a practice owner will say, but I'm selling my clientele to you. I'm selling a potential earnings to you, which is really very questionable as well, because you have no ownership of those clients. Those clients can go to somebody else if they want to. You don't own them. So I think that's also something, and I do understand we're living, and especially now in a environment, in an atmosphere where everybody's short on income, everybody's short on money. So we're trying to protect our income, but we still have to consider that we have to follow the rules of the HPCSA in that regard as well.
Yeah, and I think so. The restraint of trade is one thing that is very common in corporate in the normal business world. But I think the angle from the point of view of the Professions Council, I can't remember which booklet it's in, but I remember also there's some clause in there that talks about where not only the choice of the patient, but also you're not allowed to do anything that will impede someone's access to care. So in my mind, that is treading on very thin ice, because if you are trying to enforce a restraint of trade, technically you could argue that that would be enforcing limitation of access to care, which is clearly not allowed in our Professions Council. So I think it is tricky. What would be useful advice, because in that post that I was talking about, where people were asking about locums and paying salaries and things like that, there were quite a few therapists who, rightfully so, it is their business, it's their livelihood, and they themselves are not earning they are reliant on their own business to be able to pay themselves a salary and all the benefits and all of that stuff. So there were quite a few who gave long explanations about how expensive it is for them to have an employee, and they were kind of defending the payment of commission. So what advice can you give private practice owners in terms of how they can be compliant with the law, but still be profitable and still be able to make a living from their practices?
So the one thing that the HPCSA says when you employ somebody is your employment contract between the employer and the employee needs to be structured. I was looking at that just yesterday. It needs to be structured to, what is the words that they use? In the best interest of the public, in the best interest of the client. So you need to employ somebody to better serve the public, or to serve more people of the public. Your contract should not be for your own incentives. It should not be for you to get rich out of the 20 therapists that you employ. It should be, I employ 20 therapists to better serve more people, to get the service out there. It should not be for my own financial gain. Now, that in itself makes it very, very difficult. Practices, especially certain professions, have big overheads that needs to be covered. So the whole thing of payment on commission it's so questionable. It leads to perverse incentives. It leads to people being exploited. It leads to so many gray ethical areas. Now, the HPCSA has been very non-vocal about that. And I've addressed this with them since about 2016, 2017. And the response that I've gotten from them has been that they do not govern remuneration. So that is not within what they feel is guiding the healthcare professional. And I've taken this up, and it's been taken up with our professional board. Now, I'm a speech therapist, so with the board for speech therapy. And the board for speech therapy actually published something where they said that based on the perverse incentives, based on so many other aspects, they feel that they have good legal grounds to say that payment based on commission is not according to professional standards. But I think their wording was very clever, that it does not commit them to something where they say directly it's unethical. What they've said was they, on good grounds, believe that it would be considered unethical. It's only been the Board of Speech Language Therapy that actually addressed this matter. No other board has ever brought this up. So the reason why it could be seen as perverse incentives is that if a therapist knows that they only get 50% of, or even 40%, 30% at times, of the income that's generated, they know that they have to bill more in order for them to put bread on the table, which can lead to perverse incentives. That's the one reason. And the other thing that the HPCSA also says is that you may not share fees with somebody who's not taking a commensurate part in the services. So if I've seen the client as the locum or as the employee, and the income that is generated is shared then with the practice owner, it could also be considered as unethical. So what is the best way, and how do you go about? Ultimately, you have to work out what your overheads are for having somebody at your practice, and then work out what that person's income potential is that could help assist with the overheads, and then work it out on an hourly fee or a day fee or even a set monthly salary. I think a set monthly salary is not the easiest thing to do. It's a very big step for somebody that's heading in that direction. Maybe start with an hourly rate, so that if I work for you, I know I get 200 Rand for every hour that I work for you. It's not based on the billing that I generate from the specific client. So, so basically a set fee that the employee or the person that works at the practice knows beforehand what their monthly income will be. And it should not, and I've heard just the other day, I heard that people are paid 30% or 40% based on the amount of money that is collected, not even that is written up, that is collected. And it's not my responsibility if the clients don't. I've done the service, I've provided the service, I should get paid for that specific service that I've provided. So it really, a lot of exploitation is taking place, especially regarding payment in general.
Yeah, and then I think another thing that private practices need to be aware of, which I heard in your talk you spoke about, because billing is always a big thing that comes up, problems with medical aids and that. And you mentioned there something which I think people need to take note of, especially when using locums, where they're not using it as a stand-in. So as a stand-in, it should be one replacing the other. That's what you're saying. But what's happening is they're working alongside each other. And you mentioned something about how if you are billing under your practice number and you have, say, 2 therapists working at the same time, you're going to end up working a number of hours that's not humanly possible. And that can be flagged up by medical aid, which can cause them to audit you and end up not paying you. Maybe can you just talk a little bit about that? Because I think that is something that that's always billing and medical aid is always an issue, and that's maybe something that people don't realize.
Yeah. So what should happen is that as soon as somebody works for you, so where there are two therapists working at the same practice, you should get a group practice card where which indicates that there are more than one person that works at the specific practice. And then that within that group practice card, you allocate the service then based on the specific HPCSA number or their own private practice number. You indicate that against the billing. So it is for that exact reason that you are saying that it doesn't look like I'm providing 25 hours of therapy per day with, as a matter of fact, it's 5 therapists providing 5 hours each. So
Yeah.
it's about that group practice number that you have to have. Yeah.
Okay, so I think like when I was listening to you explain about like how people are using the term locum incorrectly, and like you said rightfully so, if you're starting out, even if you are starting to get busy, it's quite a big responsibility to take on to employ somebody, because there's the thing of you can't just fire somebody or let them go. There's a process. So there was another type of employment you mentioned, which is, I think, something that people aren't exploring enough, which is the fixed term full-time temporary contract. So where you have where you employ somebody, but it's a stated fixed term. So you can say that, okay, I'm going to employ you for a full year. You're going to come twice a week. And maybe talk a little bit about that type of contract, because I think that's a good alternative option when you're just starting out and you don't want to commit so fully into like full-time employment.
Yeah, so very often we see adverts of we have a maternity leave post opening up, which with the potential of staying on afterwards, depending on the caseload. So you don't have caseload for somebody that works 40 hours a week, but you have a caseload for one additional day that you might need somebody. It's quite possible to get a contract for somebody. I want to contract you in to work 8 hours per week for me. And you can decide how you want to work that 8 hours. You can decide whether it's 2 mornings or 2 afternoons. I just want help in the practice for an additional 8 hours per week. And that is also a specific contract that you can structure. So when we look at the basic conditions of Employment Act, what they say is if somebody works for you for more than 24 hours per month. So that is basically if somebody works 7 hours per day for 3 weeks. Then it's 28 hours. So you can structure that contract to fall under the 24 hours per month. And then you don't have to pay them UIF. You don't have to pay them UIF. You don't have to pay them annual leave. You don't have to pay them sick leave. So that's the one thing that you can do. But as soon as somebody works for you for more than 24 hours a month, whether it's a locum or an employer, you have to provide them the benefits of the basic conditions of the Employment Act. So it is possible to employ somebody for a certain number of hours per month or a certain number of hours per day. It is quite possible. So you just have to think cleverly for your practice, what is the help that you need in your specific practice. So that's the one option. The other option is to get an independent contractor to say that I have a contract or I have enough work for somebody to provide a service at my practice for 4 hours per week. And you can advertise that, and somebody can apply as an independent contractor to provide that service to you. It's not that you are employing that person, but you are providing them the space. So you can charge them a rental fee where they rent your rooms from you, and you serve more clients in your specific community. So that is also a very clever way of thinking about it, is getting a true independent contractor. And that independent contractor can then dictate the way they want to run their caseload. It's completely up to them. And you can enter into a negotiation where you say to them, I have a contract available. I need somebody at my practice for 4 hours per week. are you able to provide that service to me? So it's a service that is provided. It's not an employment. And then as an independent contractor, you can enter into a service level agreement between the practice owner and the independent contractor that not dictates the way they do things, but dictates the conditions of that specific contract. So there are ways of getting somebody at your practice without employing them and without having to worry about paid annual leave, paid sick leave, UIF, and those things, but get them to work at your practice as an independent contractor. So there are ways of going about that way. The one thing, though, also, with an independent contractor.
Now, I was just going to say, I think that the other thing is because if you do it that way, you are also, because you mentioned the person is then not reliant on you for the income, because they then do have the freedom to work in other contract out other places. They are a business in their own right. So you then are doing kind of having the advantages of a locum, but without taking advantage of somebody, which is what's happening in a lot of the locum cases.
Yeah. And then that independent contractor can say, you know what, I need to take 2 weeks leave. I'm not going to see clients for the next 2 weeks because I'm going to take my leave. And the practice owner really has got no say over that, because that independent contractor can make their own decisions in terms of how they run their specific business. But depending on the service level agreement, the practice owner can also say, but you know what, these clients are vulnerable clients. I don't want you to take unnecessary leave during the school term. Rather, take your leave during the school holiday. So that can be a very strong suggestion. You cannot dictate that specifically, though.
So I think what I want to do is also draw an analogy outside of the healthcare profession.
Yes, yeah.
So I have a digital marketing business, and it's quite common in digital marketing where you have bigger companies who contract smaller agencies in. So what that would mean is myself as Digital Engage, I'm a small little bespoke agency of just me, and I've maybe got some freelancers, and I have people that I contract out to who are freelancers. And then a big agency would maybe bring me on because they've got really a big load of clients, and so they don't want to invest all their full-time resources in the smaller clients, but they don't also want to let go that revenue. So what they would do is they would approach a company like mine and say, let's draw up a service level agreement where you are still operating within your own business. You're a registered business, but you bill us and we bill the clients. We have a retainer with them, and you bill us for whatever services you render. So I think if you draw that analogy, that's kind of what it is. And what I want to challenge is, because the Private Practice Growth Club is all about people who are wanting to either start or grow a private practice, that for those young ones who are saying, oh, they're looking for experience, don't go the locum route. Maybe that is a good way to get your feet wet, is to start your own practice as an independent contractor before you go and jump into these leases where you have to pay this rent, and now you have so much pressure to bring patients in. So, for example, I have a friend who's a physio, and what she does is she rents space in a beauty place. So she only pays for the time that she uses the room. So it's then better for her than she doesn't have that pressure of having to bring patients in. And so she renders the service. The patients are her own, and she bills the patients herself. But let's say that it wasn't a beauty therapist that she was renting rooms from. Say it was an OT or even another physio. And I think what we need to remember as private practices, we need to get out of the scarcity mindset where we are so competitive to the point we are anti-competitive. Competition should be seen as a way to up level yourself and your service, rather than to prevent someone else from receiving business. So there's this term that I often use, which is co-opetition, meaning we are competing in the sense that we are kind of trying to attract the same patients, but we cooperate in the sense that if I am open, even though both of us are seeing, say, pediatric patients, the same pediatric patients, if you as another private practice owner rent rooms in my practice, that's revenue that I'm generating passively, which means I can take time off. And so rather than seeing it as you now taking patients from me, we can then because maybe you have a better rapport with this child than I do. So why not let me let you have that patient? I earn the revenue from the rent or whatever, and I can then go and focus on the patients I do have a good report. But we've got this problem in South Africa in particular, where private practice owners are so selfish about the market, so to speak, that they are blocking other therapists from growing their practice, which is really sad. And I want to challenge private practice owners in South Africa to try and work past that. It's mainly a mindset issue that we think that there's not enough when there is more than enough for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think the need in South Africa is big. There's so many clients that need our services, and we shouldn't take ownership of a specific hospital or a specific school to say that's my school. I've bought the rights to work at that school. That's nonsense. The HPCSA doesn't see that as ethical. It's not. You cannot claim ownership. The only way ownership, not ownership, but the only way it can be managed is where the school says, or the principal of the school or the specific hospital says, but I will only allow this specific practice to work because of service level agreements. And then that practice provides the service then at that school, at the hospital. I mean, I cannot prevent and say, this is my school, you're not allowed to come see the clients here. Ultimately, the client has the right as to where they want to go to and who they want to go see. We see there's a lot with physio practices in hospitals, and the same with dietitian groups in hospitals, where we find the same thing. And the school's issues is normally the speech therapists and the OTs that have sort of take ownership of a specific school and say nobody else is allowed near my specific school. And it's not on. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, like the argument of it being a business and all of that doesn't hold water, because if I think outside of the healthcare profession, I have a lot of friends and colleagues who you would think are competitors. So my one friend does branding, the other one is a virtual assistant, and her husband is a web developer. So in a sense, we are all competing for the same clients, but that's not the relationship we have. I often share their information or refer people to them, and they refer people to me. And it's not, we never see it as I don't see it as them taking business away from me. I see it as building a relationship, because there's going to be times when I can't service a particular client, and by referring them to somebody who I know is going to do a good job down the line, they're going to need something that person can't give them. And because I referred them and they got such a good service, they're going to come back to me and ask me for my help. So you have to change the way you think about, like, and we're dealing with people here who need our help. And if you can help somebody, even if it's in a way of you not providing a paid service, but you are so helpful to them, you're always going to be somebody that they can trust to come to for help, that one day they will become a patient if the need arises. And that's kind of what we need to think about, and what I'm trying to also teach in terms of how we think of marketing. Marketing isn't what it used to be, where it's kind of shoving down people's throats, convincing them of a false message. Marketing has really become about building relationships, building trust, getting somebody to know who you are. And so I think that we need to kind of start working together as therapists and build that network among us.
No, definitely. Just the one thing that you've mentioned now is the HPCSA's main thing, and one of their main rules for us as healthcare professionals, is to always act in the best interest of the client. And we are so quick to hold on to a client and not refer them out, because once I refer them out, I lose that income. Whereas if I refer them out, that client might receive better therapy with somebody else than with me. And we should acknowledge that there are other therapists out there who are better at other things than we are. And it should be about the client's best interest. It should not be about your financial interest. It should be about the client's best interest. And I do agree that we are underpaid, and I do agree that it's difficult, and I hear that coming out of ComServe, where they earn a very good salary, trying to adapt into private practice is not the easiest thing, and that's why young therapists demand so much more than 15, 20 years ago when we started out in a practice. And we should remember that we are healthcare professionals to help and serve the public. It's not about, I mean, if you're in it for the money, you should have considered something else or try something else at this stage. It's not about the money. It's ultimately about better serving the public. And what I'm going to say now is probably not the most popular opinion, but I do believe that NHI then has a place in that, where it's about the serving of the community. It's not about, and yes, we need to earn an income and we need to survive and we need to put bread on the table, but it's about serving the community. And all of you, the day that you enrolled into the degree that you studied, in your heart, you did it because you want to help people. And we shouldn't forget that. Practice owners shouldn't forget that. Young therapists shouldn't forget that. It's about helping the community. It's about helping the public. Yeah.
And I can actually give an example of where that was put into practice, where when one of my kids had a pediatrician at the hospital, and then he kept having these issues with his ears, and it would have been easy for this pediatrician to just continue to see my child, but he actually said to me, no, you know what, you should go and see this ENT who's across the way in the hospital. He also has rooms. He's really good with ear, nose, throat stuff, and he's good with kids. So you should go and see him. Don't come to me. You're going to waste your money. Like, he actually said that to me. And I appreciated that so much, that whenever somebody asked, oh, can anybody recommend a good pediatrician, I always gave him name.
Yeah.
And that's just also an example of how, where you would think that would go against the grain of sort of business practices. He's turning me away onto another professional, because I never went back to him again. I didn't have the need for him. I now had this ENT and I went to my GP. So in a sense, he was losing my business, but he could have been gained so many more patients, because I was referring people, because I was so impressed that he was willing to do that. And the ENT he referred me to really was really great. So that's also just an example I think people need to think about. So thank you so much. I really want to encourage people to do your course on Calabash, because it really covered so much more than we had time for today. And also then you have the added advantage of having your CPD points, which is always a plus, and you can do it in the comfort of your home. I mean, I watched on my phone, so I watched the whole thing on my phone, so which was great. So I'm going to put the details of all of that, but basically people can just go to calabash.courses and look for Ethics Simplified. What other courses do you have on there besides the employment?
We have, and I think it's a very good one. I'm very biased, but I think it's a really good course on ethics in schools. So we touch on consent is the one talk, and the other talk is on confidentiality, which is a big sort of a, I think the school setting just is a lot different than working in a hospital or working in a private practice. So it touches on consent and confidentiality, the other one. And we do speak about the POPI Act briefly on the confidentiality one, which now obviously brings in a lot of other aspects. And then the other two talks that we have is on effective contracting. So drawing up a contract for your private practice, could be your public sector practice as well. But on treatment consent is the one. And the other one is on billing consent. So making sure that you have everything that you need to have in your contract for billing consent. So those are the two, or the the 6 talks that I have. All of them are sort of paired at the moment, and if you watch them or buy them together, it's a discount on the bundle. That's the one thing. And then the talk on the effective contracting one. If you do the talks, you actually get a copy of a contract that we have available as
that's
well.
awesome.
So, yeah. So that is really
awesome.
a good starting point for private practices to just make sure, especially young therapists, to go through that and to see, but these are the things that I need to have in place. Yeah.
And that is so important. I think people must never underestimate the importance of the legal side. I can't repeat that enough, because I know from even in my digital marketing business, one of the things where I lost a lot of money was not having an effective contract in place, not having a good onboarding process in place. So in digital marketing, when you have somebody who wants to buy a website, and then if you don't have a good structured onboarding system where it's very clear what the expectations are, you're going to have something which in that industry we call scope creep, with the expectation of the client is beyond what you have as an expectation of what service you're going to provide, and then the expectation of payment. So it needs to be, and I think because as health professionals we tend to shy away from money talk. It's not something we are comfortable with. That was a problem I had, even though I wasn't even in a healthcare profession. It's like you don't like asking for money or talking about money, and especially with patients, and especially when you're working with pediatrics. But it's such an important thing to have in place. So I think that's excellent. I think people, if you can do that course, especially when you're just starting out, having those basic building blocks in place can really make a difference in helping you grow your practice faster. You don't have to stress about those things. And then
just on sorry, just another thing about the contracts. When we think about employment ethics, you have to have an employment contract. Even if you have an independent contractor working at you, you have to have some form of signed documentation that protects both parties. It protects the employer, and also it protects either the locum, the employee, or the independent contractor. And the HPCSA says that if they are entitled to ask for a copy of that contract, so you have to have that in place. It's really very, very important. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, you mentioned briefly that the one of the talks briefly talks about the POPI Act. Do you have any plans of doing something more in depth? Because now from the 1st of July, the POPI Act has been passed into law. And so I believe I believe we have a year, all therapists, private practice therapists have 1 year to comply with everything. Most people won't know that. Do you have plans to do a more kind of in-depth course on the POPI Act?
Yeah, I have thought about it the last week or two. I think the reason why I haven't done it at the stage is due to there's so many legal aspects about that, and I'm not a lawyer, so I will say that SASHLA, the South African Speech Language Hearing Association, had podcasts by Elsie Klink, so if you're a SASHLA member, you have access to that for free. And I actually listened to that podcast now over the last few days. It's really very, very good, the ins and outs of the POPI Act. And then Elsie Klink also, I think on the 17th of July, I'm not sure exactly, they have it's from 10 until 3 in the afternoon, a whole day workshop almost on becoming POPI compliant. So where they will take you through the different steps. So I think as a starting point, that might be a really good something to consider to make sure, and that's from the legal perspective. Elsie Klink and Associates it's a law firm that work in health law. So they might be the best person to consult. But I'm definitely thinking of doing a brief 1 hour sort of just to get people going on the right. Yeah.
To at least know what it is, because I think for most people they don't even know what the POPI Act is.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for your time. There were a few people who will kind of like hop on and off, but I think most people will probably watch the replay. And if you are watching the replay and you have any questions, please just type in the comments #replay so that we know that you are watching the replay, and then ask your question. And then and then we can see what answers there are to that. And then, like as I said, I will edit this video to put it up onto YouTube, so you can always watch it at any time. Thank you so much for your time, Annelie.
No, thank you very much for the opportunity.
And I will put all the links as well for the Calabash courses in the comments to this, and it will be in the description of the YouTube video as well.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Have a good night. Bye.